Before dawn, the air above the African interior often carried a strange stillness. No cannon smoke hung in the sky yet. No European banners marked the horizon. But messengers were already moving through the night, barefoot and fast, carrying warnings that would reach forts, trading posts, and rival courts long before sunrise. A queen was preparing for war, and the fear she inspired did not come from rumor or superstition. It came from memory. Fear, in the historical record, is rarely shouted. It is measured quietly, in how often enemies retreat, how many times treaties are rewritten, how persistently a single ruler forces empires to adapt their plans. In Africa, long before colonial borders hardened into maps, fear was a strategic currency. It lived in dispatches, in the sudden abandonment of roads, in the fortification of cities that had once stood open. To understand what it meant for a ruler to be feared, especially a woman in a world that expected male command, we have to strip the word of its modern drama and return it to evidence. Across pre-colonial Africa, warfare was not chaos. It followed systems, traditions, and political logic. Armies were raised through lineage and obligation. Cavalry dominated the Sahel. Infantry formations ruled the forests. Power was measured in the ability to mobilize, sustain, and control violence over time. A ruler was feared not because they won one battle, but because their presence reshaped the behavior of everyone around them. Traders altered routes. Rivals delayed campaigns. Foreign powers negotiated instead of advancing. By the time European empires reached deeper into the continent in the 15th and 16th centuries, they brought new weapons and new assumptions. They believed fear could be manufactured quickly, with cannon fire and steel. But what they encountered instead were political systems already fluent in intimidation, deterrence, and long-term resistance. Some African rulers adapted, others collapsed, and a few did something the Europeans did not expect at all. They refused to disappear. One Portuguese officer writing from the Angolan interior in the 17th century did not describe a monster or a legend. He described a problem. Campaigns stalled. Garrisons were isolated. Supplies vanished. Alliances shifted without warning. And at the center of these disruptions stood a queen, whose name appeared again and again in military correspondence, not as a curiosity, but as an obstacle. This is where historical fear becomes visible. When an enemy writes about you repeatedly, when they change strategy because of you, when decades later they are still fighting the same war, fear has left the realm of myth and entered the archive. If you're watching this now, stay with the story to the end. What unfolds isn't about crowning a single legend, but about understanding how fear was built, measured, and sustained in a world where power was never guaranteed. By the final moments, the question of who was most feared will matter less than how fear itself became a weapon wielded with patience, intelligence, and resolve. Like and subscribe if you want to see how this investigation leads somewhere far more complex than a simple name. To historians, fear is legible in persistence. A feared ruler forces repetition, repeated invasions, repeated negotiations, repeated failures. European empires kept records obsessively, and in those records, the same African queens surface across decades. Not because they were exotic, but because they would not go away. Their armies reformed after defeats. Their alliances shifted with precision. Their political survival outlasted governors, commanders, and kings sent to remove them. This is why oral tradition alone is not enough. Oral memory preserves reputation, but archives preserve reaction. When a rival state fortifies its borders specifically in response to one leader, fear is documented. When caravans detour around a kingdom rather than pass through it, fear has altered economics. When missionaries delay entry, when forts are reinforced instead of expanded, fear has entered planning rooms thousands of miles away. In African contexts, fear was also relational. It depended on proximity and consequence. A queen ruling a centralized state with standing forces could project fear far beyond her capital. A ruler controlling trade choke points could instill fear without marching at all. Some queens expanded territory aggressively. Others destabilized regions simply by refusing to be conquered. Both forms mattered. Both left traces. European chroniclers often misunderstood this. They searched for decisive victories, for climactic defeats. But African warfare frequently operated through attrition, containment, and delay. A feared leader did not need to annihilate an enemy. She only needed to deny them success long enough for their objectives to collapse under cost and exhaustion. Fear, in this sense, was cumulative. Gender makes this history sharper, not softer. In many African societies, female political authority already existed in defined forms: queen mothers, regents, spiritual leaders, custodians of land and lineage. But commanding armies elevated these roles into something that unsettled both African rivals and European observers. When a woman not only ruled, but directed warfare, fear intensified because expectations failed. Enemies could not predict her limits. This unpredictability appears again and again in the sources. European officers describe surprise at negotiations initiated by queens who had just inflicted defeats. African rivals speak of rulers who combined ritual authority with military command, binding soldiers through belief as much as discipline. Fear emerged not from brutality alone, but from coherence. These queens aligned politics, war, and legitimacy into systems that resisted removal. So when we ask who was most feared, the answer cannot come from legend or modern bravado. It must come from duration, disruption, and documented response. How long did enemies fight her? How much did they change because of her? How often did her name appear in their fears, their letters, their contingency plans? Only with those questions in place can any comparison begin. Only then can we move from atmosphere to analysis, from reputation to record. And only then can the story shift from defining fear to witnessing it in action, as queens transformed authority into resistance and resistance into history. Power did not arrive suddenly for these queens. It was assembled, piece by piece, through moments of crisis that left no room for hesitation. Succession disputes fractured courts. External threats pressed against borders. Male claimants failed, fled, or were killed. And in those ruptures, women stepped forward not as symbols, but as solutions. In many African political systems, rulership was not a single throne, but a network. Authority flowed through lineage, councils, spiritual legitimacy, and military loyalty. A queen did not simply declare command. She had to be recognized by elders, accepted by warriors, and feared by rivals. This meant that female military leadership was rarely accidental. It emerged where governance itself demanded adaptability. Some queens rose as regents, entrusted with power during instability, only to refuse to surrender it once the crisis passed. Others navigated succession rules creatively, redefining kinship and legitimacy to secure their position. In the kingdom of Ndongo, for example, political authority was deeply tied to lineage and ritual. When a woman claimed power there, it was not through brute force alone, but through mastery of custom, language, and symbolism. Fear followed not because she violated tradition, but because she understood it better than anyone else. Military command was inseparable from this political intelligence. African armies were not standing forces in the European sense. They were mobilized through obligation and loyalty, reinforced by ritual oaths and shared identity. A queen who commanded such an army needed more than tactical skill. She needed moral authority. Soldiers had to believe that her survival meant their survival, that her defeat would unravel the world they knew. This is where fear began to take shape, not on the battlefield first, but in the court. Rivals watched carefully as these queens consolidated power, replacing uncertain alliances with disciplined structures. War councils expanded. Commanders were rotated to prevent loyalty fractures. Intelligence networks grew denser. When conflict came, it arrived backed by preparation. European observers often mistook this process for deception or manipulation. They wrote of queens who negotiated one day and attacked the next, who appeared conciliatory until they weren't. But this was not duplicity. It was strategy shaped by political reality. A ruler who could not afford a single decisive battle learned to survive through flexibility. And survival, repeated over years, hardened into fear. The presence of a queen at the center of this system altered enemy calculations. European officers trained to read hierarchies struggled to anticipate responses from courts where authority was layered rather than singular. African rivals faced an even greater challenge. To confront such a queen was to confront not just an army, but a social order that justified her command through tradition, religion, and necessity. This dynamic becomes visible in moments of negotiation. Treaties involving queens are often longer, more conditional, more frequently violated by Europeans who underestimated them. Yet those same treaties were repeatedly re-signed. The very need to renegotiate speaks volumes. A powerless ruler is ignored. A feared one is accommodated. Gender, again, intensified this effect. Enemies assumed limits where none existed. They expected emotional governance or symbolic leadership. Instead, they encountered logistical planning, intelligence gathering, and ruthless patience. When campaigns failed, explanations turned personal. Chroniclers blamed weather, terrain, or treachery, anything but the queen herself. But her shadow remained. Over time, the queen ceased to be seen as an anomaly and became a system. Her court functioned around warfare. Diplomacy served military ends. Religion sanctified resistance. Fear, at this stage, was no longer reactionary. It was anticipatory. Rivals prepared for wars she had not yet declared. Empires allocated resources simply because she still ruled. This is the transformation that matters. The moment a ruler stops being feared for what she does and begins to be feared for what she might do. It is here that leadership becomes deterrence. Here that survival becomes dominance. And here that individual queens move beyond biography and into historical force. The stage is now set for examining the clearest case where this system operated over decades against a global empire, leaving behind an archive so dense it removes all doubt about fear, resistance, and impact. The war did not begin with a single declaration. It crept forward through broken alliances, seized hostages, and the quiet hardening of borders. By the time Portuguese commanders understood what they were facing in central Angola, the conflict had already escaped their control. At its center stood a ruler who refused the role history had assigned her, and in doing so, rewrote the rules of imperial expansion. Her name was Nzinga. When Nzinga first entered Portuguese records in the early 17th century, she appeared as a diplomat, not a general. She negotiated from a position of apparent weakness, using language, ritual, and patience as weapons. But this was not submission. It was reconnaissance. Nzinga learned how her enemies thought, how they documented power, how they measured victory. When diplomacy failed, she shifted seamlessly into war. What followed was not a rebellion, but a sustained campaign of resistance that lasted nearly 4 decades. Portuguese governors came and went. Commanders were replaced. Strategies were revised. Nzinga remained. This alone distinguishes her from most figures labeled as feared. Fear deepens when time fails to erase a threat. Nzinga did not rely on a single army or fixed capital. She moved her court deliberately, denying the Portuguese the decisive engagement they sought. When defeated, she retreated into the interior, regrouped, and returned stronger. She absorbed displaced peoples, expanded her forces, and forged alliances with groups equally threatened by colonial encroachment. Each loss widened her base. Each victory multiplied her reputation. Portuguese correspondence reveals growing frustration. Campaigns described as final collapsed into stalemates. Forts built to project power became defensive outposts. Supply lines stretched thin. Disease ravaged troops unfamiliar with the terrain. And always, reports returned to the same conclusion. Nzinga's forces had vanished, only to reappear elsewhere, striking where least expected. Her adaptability terrified colonial planners. Nzinga adopted firearms when they proved useful, without abandoning traditional tactics. She integrated mercenaries, defectors, and rival warriors into a single fighting system. She exploited European rivalries, aligning with the Dutch when it served her interests, then turning away when it did not. To face Nzinga was to face a strategist unconcerned with ideological purity, focused only on survival and leverage. Even when treaties were signed, they brought no relief. Nzinga treated agreements as tools, not endpoints. She honored them when they preserved her autonomy and discarded them when they did not. Portuguese officials complained that peace under Nzinga felt indistinguishable from war. That uncertainty itself became a weapon. Perhaps most unsettling was how completely she redefined legitimacy. Nzinga crowned herself ruler of Matamba, transforming a regional power into a sanctuary for those fleeing Portuguese control. Enslaved people escaped to her territory in large numbers, swelling her population and workforce. This alone threatened the colonial economy. Fear now extended beyond the battlefield into the foundations of empire. European chroniclers struggled to categorize her. They oscillated between admiration and condemnation, unable to reconcile her political intelligence with their assumptions about gender and authority. Yet their writing betrays a truth they could not deny. Nzinga was effective. She outlasted opposition not through brute force, but through endurance, adaptation, and relentless pressure. By the time Nzinga died in 1663, she had forced the Portuguese to accept a reality they could not conquer. Her kingdom endured. Her name lingered in military planning long after her death. She had not defeated an empire outright, but she had bent it, delayed it, and reshaped its ambitions. This is what fear looks like when stripped of legend. Not a single catastrophic loss, but a sustained inability to win. Not terror, but exhaustion. Nzinga did not need to destroy her enemies to be feared. She only needed to make conquest impossible on their terms. Yet her story, powerful as it is, does not stand alone. Across the continent, other queens forged their own versions of fear, rooted in different landscapes, economies, and military traditions. To understand whether Nzinga was singular or part of a broader pattern, the lens must widen. Fear did not wear the same uniform across Africa. It adapted to terrain, economy, and political culture, just as warfare itself did. To move beyond a single figure, the comparison must widen, not to dilute Nzinga's impact, but to test whether her kind of power echoed elsewhere. And in the open savannas of the central Sahel, centuries earlier, another queen had already demonstrated a different architecture of fear. Amina of Zazao emerges from a thinner archive, but not an empty one. Her name appears in Hausa chronicles, later corroborated by British colonial records that encountered cities fortified long before European arrival. These walls, stretching for miles, were not ceremonial. They were built by a state that expected war and had survived it repeatedly. Fear here was territorial, measured in expansion rather than endurance. Amina ruled in an environment dominated by cavalry warfare. Speed mattered. Shock mattered. Under her command, Zazao expanded aggressively, projecting power across trade routes that linked the Sahel to the forest zones below. Control of these routes meant control of wealth, weapons, and intelligence. Rival states did not simply lose battles, they lost access. Fear followed commerce as much as conflict. What distinguishes Amina is scale. Oral tradition attributes dozens of campaigns to her reign, but even when those numbers are treated cautiously, the pattern remains clear. Zazao did not merely defend itself, it advanced. Cities submitted preemptively. Tribute replaced siege. Fortifications rose not because war was imminent, but because Amina's reach made it inevitable. Unlike Nzinga, whose fear grew through refusal and delay, Amina's power moved forward. Her presence altered the political geography of the Hausa states. Borders hardened, alliances restructured, and crucially, her military authority became institutionalized. Expansion continued even after her death, suggesting a system strong enough to survive its founder. Further south and east, other queens exercised fear through different mechanisms. Some ruled through spiritual authority that translated directly into military obedience. Others controlled choke points along rivers and coasts, where a single decision could starve rivals of trade. In each case, fear was not spectacle. It was consequence. European contact complicates this comparison. Queens like Nzinga faced external empires whose records preserved fear in bureaucratic detail. Others, like Amina, confronted regional rivals whose histories were carried orally until written later. This does not weaken their impact, but it changes how it must be evaluated. Absence of paperwork does not equal absence of fear. It shifts the burden to archaeology, urban design, and political continuity. What unites these queens is not temperament or legend, but outcome. Each forced surrounding powers to respond. Each altered military planning beyond her borders. Each transformed leadership into deterrence. Fear, in these cases, was not personal. It was systemic. And this is where comparison becomes revealing. Nzinga's fear lay in making conquest unsustainable. Amina's lay in making resistance futile. One exhausted an empire. The other expanded a state until submission became rational. Both forms disrupted existing power structures. Both left legacies written into maps. By widening the lens, the question shifts. The issue is no longer which queen inspired the most dread in isolation, but how different forms of fear operated across African warfare. Endurance versus expansion. Delay versus dominance. Each shaped history in ways European narratives long failed to capture. To judge who was most feared, then, is not to crown a single name, but to understand how fear itself functioned as strategy, adapted to context, and survived the women who wielded it. Only by examining what remained after the wars ended can the final assessment begin. When the wars ended, fear did not disappear. It settled into memory, into walls that still traced old borders, into treaties that shaped colonial caution, into silences where conquest had been expected but never completed. This is where judgment belongs. Not on the battlefield, but in what survived it. For queens like Nzinga, fear translated into delay. Empires that planned swift domination found themselves entangled for decades, forced to compromise ambitions and redirect resources. Portuguese Angola did not unfold according to imperial design. It grew slowly, unevenly, shaped by resistance that could not be erased. Nzinga's greatest victory was not territorial expansion, but time. Time denied to her enemies, time granted to her people, time that preserved autonomy long enough to alter history's direction. For queens like Amina, fear translated into permanence. Fortified cities did not vanish when she died. Trade routes continued to reflect the power structures she enforced. The political geography of the Hausa states bore her imprint long after oral tradition turned her campaigns into legend. Expansion hardened into inheritance. Here, fear became infrastructure. Colonial narratives struggled with this complexity. Administrators preferred tidy explanations: rebellion crushed, resistance overcome, authority restored. Queens disrupted that clarity. They did not fit the expected arc of conquest. As a result, their stories were often minimized, reframed, or mythologized into harmless legend. Fear, once acknowledged in military reports, softened into folklore. Modern historians face the inverse challenge: to recover fear without exaggeration, to respect oral memory without surrendering to spectacle, to read European archives critically, recognizing that frustration, delay, and repetition are themselves evidence. When a ruler appears again and again in enemy correspondence, when plans change because of her continued existence, fear is no longer subjective. It is operational. So who was most feared? The question resists a single answer because fear itself was not singular. It was contextual. Nzinga was feared because she made conquest impossible on schedule. Amina was feared because she made resistance strategically irrational. Others, less documented, but no less real, ruled through spiritual authority, trade control, or geographic mastery. Each shaped fear to their environment. What matters is that these queens forced power to adapt. They denied inevitability. They revealed that empire was not destiny, and that leadership, even when constrained by gendered expectations, could outthink and outlast overwhelming force. Fear, in their hands, was not terror. It was clarity imposed on enemies who assumed superiority. In the end, the most feared queen is not a title to be awarded, but a lens through which history sharpens. It reminds us that power does not always roar. Sometimes it waits, endures, expands, or refuses. And in doing so, it changes what victory means. They were not feared because they were violent. They were feared because they could not be removed.